welcome to Commander and Chits, a cardboard reality podcast show where we discuss historical wargames. Today I'm joined by Nick, and we'll be discussing Combat Commander Europe. We'll also be describing the historical background of the scenario, the battle for Humane Belgium in 1944. Enjoy the show! Hi there, cardboard enthusiasts. This is Scott.
Hello, it's Nick.
Today we're going to be talking about Combat Commander, the GMT game by Chad Jensen. This is a hex encounter squad-based war game.
So for the folks that are listening at home, what does hex encounter mean if they don't understand war games?
Right. So we have these chits, which are the counters, and this is on a hex map, and that just describes the way in which the units are represented and move about the map.
Yes. All of the chits in hex encounter are typically going to have different stats on them, like their firepower or attack value, movement, range, things like that.
Morale and such. So we've played Combat Commander a few times now. The latest game that we played, we did the scenario Battle for Humane Belgium.
Yep.
Which takes place on December 27th, 1944.
So the war ended in 1945.
Correct.
What was the day?
Oh, you're going to call me out like
I'm
that?
going to put you on the spot. Do you know like the month or like the time of year?
I do not remember the day.
I didn't know if it was like 6 months prior to the end of the war or...
No. So this is taking place during the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944. This was the last major assault by Germany on the Western Front, and it was the deadliest battle for the U.S. forces in the entire war in Europe. It began on December 16th when skies were overcast and the U.S. was not able to bring their full air superiority to bear, which we dominated the skies at this point. And that was one of the major reasons that they picked this weather and this time. And because of our lack of air reconnaissance, they were able to launch this surprise offensive. And the overall goal of this offensive was to cut us off from the port of Antwerp, which the Allies needed in order to supply their forces. They were having a lot of supply issues up to this point, trying to supply forces in Normandy and in Belgium.
Okay.
And the overall goal was also to then encircle and destroy the Allied forces in the West to try to force an armistice. So that way they could bring an end to the war. Because at this point they didn't...
So what's an armistice?
Basically a peace treaty.
Okay.
With favorable terms for the Axis.
Okay.
Like I said earlier, this scenario happens on the 27th. So the offensive had already been underway. And at this point, the initiative has kind of been lost by the Axis. And now you have an Allied counterattack retaking objectives that had previously been lost.
So you said this was December 27th?
Yes, December 27th.
Germany?
So Germany is now on the defensive at this point.
No. What country were they in?
Oh, this is in Belgium.
Belgium, okay.
Yes. So the 2nd Panzer group was tasked basically with the operation to cut them off from Antwerp. And within that, there was the Panzer Lair and the 2nd Panzer Division, which is described in the scenario description as the forces that are holding Humane Belgium. And the 2nd Panzer Division are who the U.S. are fighting in this scenario itself. The Panzer Lair were the best of the best. They were the instructors who were training other tank units. And so they were the only division that was actually fully equipped with tanks and half-tracks at this point. Mm-hmm. Germany has lost most of their armored vehicles and their tanks, and so most units are fighting not at full strength at this point. In fact, the Germans only brought around like 450 tanks in the Ardennes offensive, whereas the Americans, the Allies in general, brought about 1,700 tanks.
Okay. And combat commander is, they don't have any tanks in this. No. It's just infantry.
Now, Chad Jensen specifically wanted to focus on the infantry element of this. And so with this one, this is one of the few remaining holdouts in the city of Humane after the battle. And you're trying to break this final holdout, whereas most of the German forces have already surrendered.
Yeah. So the map is a large estate. So the center of the board, and if you're watching video, you might be able to kind of make it out because we have our game state from when the game ended. We actually just left it set up on the table here. So yeah, the middle of the map is just this giant building that is worth like 15 victory points. It's basically the objective. It's an attack and defense sort of scenario. And like Scott's been saying, the Germans are trying to hold out and the Americans are pushing on the offense.
That's right. So, as we all know, the Ardennes offensive was ultimately a failure. It did delay the Allies by about 5 or 6 weeks, but both sides took roughly the same number of casualties.
Really? Okay.
The Allies took around 90,000 casualties. That's captured, wounded, and killed combined, whereas the Germans were between 60 and 80,000.
That's amazing to me how many casualties happened during World War II, especially once you include the Holocaust.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing, I guess.
Yeah.
To put that into a little bit of perspective into why Germany is fighting in such a weakened state at this point, if you look at the Battle of Stalingrad a year prior in 1943, the combined German casualties over that 5-month period was around 800,000.
Wow.
Yeah. So at this point in the war, most German divisions are undermanned and also under-equipped.
I bet.
So this was sort of their last gambit, a hope to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and hopefully get a favorable peace deal so that they could focus on the Eastern Front.
So Germany, they were kind of in cahoots with Japan, right?
Yeah, sort of.
So were they in with Japan when Japan bombed Hawaii, Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, so there wasn't actually a whole lot of coordination between them.
Because that's what got the America in the war, right? The United States were currently trying to stay out.
Right. So America, their involvement at this point when Pearl Harbor happened was limited solely to Lend-Lease, where they were giving supplies to the Soviets and the British, and that was the limit of their support, basically.
Yeah. I just wonder if that was just a really poor strategic move from Japan that really crippled Germany in the long run.
Right. In the long run, it's not good for Germany, but it was really the only hope that Japan had. They saw war as inevitable with the U.S., and they hoped that if they could eliminate the U.S. fleet, they could take them out of the war before it even began.
Yeah, I could see that.
But I believe only several of the warships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor never returned to service. Most of them that were damaged or sunk actually returned to service before the end of the war.
Yeah. And we definitely didn't end as the good guys either in this war. The bombing on Japan, but that's a whole nother story.
That's a whole nother story. That's a debate to be had another time. So let's talk a little bit about our experience with the scenario in particular. And maybe just some of the mechanics in general. So I was playing as the German army in this one, and I was in a defensive posture.
Yep.
And you were in the offensive posture, which decides how many cards you have in your hand.
Yep.
We both had elite units.
So on the defense, you're going to have a smaller hand.
Yes. You have a smaller hand, and then each country individually has a different number of cards it can discard each turn if it decides to empty its hand to look for better cards.
Yep. So in this game, each player is going to have a fate deck, which is just your giant stack of cards. And these cards are going to have a bunch of different things on them. When you look at it, you're going to have the order on top. That's the action you can do every round. Then you have actions, which are secondary actions that you can do out of turn occasionally when they're triggered.
Yeah. The actions will tell you exactly
when you can
play them and what they do.
Yeah. And then at the bottom of the card, you have die roll. So there's actually like pictures of like die pips. So when you ever make a die roll, instead of rolling dice in this game, you actually just flip a card. And then it also has events on it.
Right. And so sometimes whenever you flip a card to do a die roll, it'll have a red border on it, and then that'll be something that happens.
Yes.
And it could be that it triggers an event, in which case you'll flip the next top card and do whatever its event says.
Yep.
Could be a sniper will fire somewhere on the board. And there's just a wide range of things that could happen off the top there.
Crazy stuff can happen.
Yeah. It's really trying to simulate, the chaos of this like close infantry combat where you just have, bullets flying and people are taking cover and returning fire.
Yeah, and the idea is that like you're kind of a commander making orders on the battlefield, and you have some like units, say in a house somewhere, and you're trying to get them to do something, but they're not moving, they're not firing, they're not responding, and it just mimics like the fear and like it simulates kind of like what you would feel like in a war zone, and that's simulated by having cards in your hand that bloat your deck, like Command Confusion,
right,
which is exactly that.
And there's also orders that you might just not be able to use at all.
Yep. Or your gun can jam. There's any number of situations where something should have worked out for you and it doesn't. And it's always surprising as to what happens.
Yeah, really. And the game, it plays out, it's very intense.
Yep.
I was on the edge of my seat the entire time. I was sweating for some parts, and it's a special game that does that, I think.
So one thing I always look for in historical war games, and something I think that keeps making me come back to these types of games, is that it tells a narrative. Do you feel like there was a narrative that unfolded during this play?
I would say that I felt that.
Yeah.
Like it tells a story, and sometimes some bad stuff will happen to you, but usually it happens in a way it's like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And it's just like, it's not really that frustrating. So I think it accomplishes like making the randomness feel like these are, events that are like you're trying to respond to these changing events.
And I think that's the crux of this game. Why? I can't quite put a finger on why the randomness is okay in this game. This is a 2 to 3 hour game we're talking about. And there is a lot of randomness in it, but there's something about like, I'm excited to see, I welcome the randomness in this game. That's what makes this game come alive. Even when it's like not in my favor, I'm still like cheering at the game's design for what happened.
Right.
And do you have a reason as to why it's fun in this game?
That is a good question. I think it's because usually the randomness is not completely devastating. I think that's accurate. It can occasionally be, but usually it's a lot of small victories that add up. And
it's like an edge of your seat sort of randomness. It's fun when you go and you fire on a group of people, you're going to draw a card. And anytime you draw a card for a dice roll, you can trigger, like we said, events. And it's always fun to see what those events are. So that's my favorite part, is the reveal of the card. Did I get an event? Is it a sniper? Did I shoot Scott? Did I accidentally break one of his units somewhere on the board? Am I able to fix one of my guns? There's just all kinds of things that can potentially happen from a card draw. And they're not always good. Sometimes bad things happen, like my units get broken.
Right.
Or eliminated or whatever.
Or when I have no more commanders on the field and I flip over an event that suppresses every German unit that's not within range of a commander. And so now I've just suppressed every single unit I have on the board.
Or a breeze can trigger and it will blow out smoke that's on the board. Or if there's a blaze to like fire on a hex, then the fire will spread.
Right.
So things like that can happen as well.
Yeah. This game also has a lot of attention to detail. And while it abstracts some things, it's usually just for the sake of speed of resolving what's happening. And I still think it does a pretty good job of having a lot of detail without a lot of bloat.
Yeah. And I've also read where the designer's intentions with like the sniper event isn't always that it's a sniper that picked you off.
Mm-hmm.
It can be any number of random things that happen in a war scenario where a squad might break for some reason or get scared or have like shrapnel.
Right. And like a sniper fire, and this is why I think it's an area for sniper fire, is like just the feeling that there is a sniper that can see you.
Yep.
Could break a unit. Like they're now, like their morale is low and they're scattered and they're just trying to take cover.
And speaking of cover, that's one thing I love in this game. The base game. So if you're watching the video, here is Combat Commander Europe. That's the base game. And then this other big box here is Mediterranean, which is the big box expansion that you can get for it. This was actually intended to be just one game, no expansion, but it would have been so expensive to produce just the one, so they split it. GMT made the decision to split. So with just the base game, you have 12 maps. That's 6 front and back.
Mm-hmm.
You get the expansion. Now you have a total of 24 maps, which is just an insane amount of maps for this game. And then each of these maps are very different. Some take place just inside buildings. Some are wide open. Most of them are wide open landscapes. Some have forests or a bunch of houses or like fences. Some have hills. So you are doing line of sight over like hilltops,
Mm-hmm.
And that affects gameplay. Just a lot of really interesting decisions in how you move your units, where you leave them based off of what kind of cover they're going to get, what the line of sight is going to be. And that always adds something really crucial to think about when you're moving your troops, to set them up in a spot that they can fire on the opposition easily, but also not leaving them out in the open. And then also terrain affects your movement too. So if you're moving through a forest, obviously you're going to move slower than if you're moving on a road.
Right. And like the opportunity fire and the cover and the line of sight, it
lets you fire out of turn. Like if I'm moving, Scott can play opportunity fire and fire on my dudes as they're moving outside of cover, which makes sense. Right. And it's a risk I'm willing to take if you need to move your troops.
Right. And so like you're trying to move your guys from cover to cover and you're trying to battle your way through, get close, push the enemy out of their cover to take these like strategic positions.
And at the beginning of this game, so like I said, it's the biggest state. Around the state, you have a giant stone wall. And I started one of my commanders or leaders and a bunch of troops kind of on the main road here leading into the estate. But there was some enemy Germans in this side building that were kind of like a choke point. So I branched off to attack them. And little did I know, Scott had a defense card that popped out a minefield. So my guys, when they were moving, found themselves in a minefield.
Yeah. And so now they're in a minefield right next to an enemy occupied building with, rifles pointed at them.
Yep. Which I think it didn't actually break my units. I think I got lucky on the rolls.
Right.
But it definitely added a layer of tension where it really could have messed up my plans if I hadn't rolled well. The time track also really sped up in this round, or this play of Combat Commander. Mm-hmm. So the time track in this game exists to kind of speed along the game in case the people are turtling or you're just rolling bad and you're not breaking units. The game's not moving forward. So the time track just serves as one of a few ways the game could potentially end.
Right. And I feel like it's probably the main way that the defender can win in this scenario.
Yeah.
The defender, the Germans, they're outnumbered and they're outgunned, which it's just a really bad spot to be in because, like the Allies can form larger firing groups to have more firepower. So even though you have to, move into my defensive terrain, you still have that advantage of numbers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, I find that really kind of fascinating. And that in this game, you're not always going to be defending or attacking. Sometimes there's scenarios where you're both recon. So you both draw 5 cards instead of 4 and 6. Mm-hmm. And you both are sort of on the offense defense together and you're fighting over objectives. Typically in this game, you're going to be fighting over some sort of objective or multiple objectives on the board. So it's always something new to play out. Even if we replayed this scenario we just played,
right,
we're going to potentially put our troops in different locations because we'll learn from our mistakes this past game. and card draws are going to come out differently. Events are going to happen differently. The gameplay and the game state is going to be vastly different from what it is right now.
Right. I ended up being pretty satisfied, I think, with how I set up, maybe with some small changes here and there. For instance, I had set up this row of wire on the right side of this building because it was so close.
The main estate building.
To the main estate building. Because it was so close to these trees and this wall here. I didn't want you to just come down this road, and hop over the wall and be right here to storm the building.
Right.
So I was kind of hoping to funnel you through this way in front, and I had these two, heavy machine guns here.
Yep. And thankfully for me, I did end up scaling the walls leading from the front of the estate, and I had people basically, I had guns on me, and thankfully there's a bunch of trees or like little forest hexes that were laid out in front of the estate that I could strategically or tactically move my troops into and around those to help block some of the potential fire that I would have been receiving from units over here in this shed or from the main estate.
Right.
Which I think helped me slowly inch my way closer and closer to the objective.
I think one thing that I may have done differently is I think I put too much priority on trying to minimize the possible damage of artillery fire, which didn't end up being a huge factor.
Yeah, and I don't think it really is, especially the radio that I have. It's going to deal 8 damage. There's randomness on where it's going to land, sort of.
Right.
You get to place out, you get to choose the spotting round on where it's going to initially start, but then you have to make a targeting roll to see if it actually will hit. And if it does, then you still draw another card, and it moves 2 hexes in different directions to see where it finally lands.
Right. And so it made it kind of hard for me to form effective firing groups because my soldiers were spread out.
I noticed that with your setup.
Yeah. It did have the beneficial side effect, though, that you kind of spent your time, instead of advancing, you had to stop and, take out each one of these rifle units that were in the woods one at a time before you could advance. And the way that I eventually won was that the time ran out.
Yep. Yeah. It was coming down to the wire. Scott was on his heels. I had basically breached the main estate. I moved into the building and won a melee combat, which can be real sketchy.
Yeah, that's a real big swing when those happen.
Because when you move into you have to use the advance action or order.
Yeah.
So yeah, you use the advance order, and that lets you move 1 spot away. So like just 1 adjacent hex. And then wherever you land in that hex, if there's enemy units in there, you're going to fight them to the death. And if you both end up adding up your firepower and rolling and it equals out, everyone dies in the hex. Or if I have more, I would win. Or if Scott has more, he would win. So sometimes it really comes down to the card flip die roll. And like Scott said, it's a huge swing. If you have 2 units in a hex, when you do that melee and they die, that's like a big point of defense that you just lost.
Right. Like losing probably like a fourth of my forces in one go, as well as giving up 4 victory points. It can be a big blow.
And it's always some tension with that because there's actions that you can play out of turn that are called ambush. These are crucial. You kind of want to keep one of these in your hand if you think a melee might be coming up, because if you play that when a melee triggers, you actually get to break an enemy unit before the melee starts, which reduces their firepower, increases your chance of winning the melee. It's a big deal to win a melee.
Right. And actually, your opponent picks what breaks.
Okay. Yep.
Which can be important because if your opponent has a unit that's already broken, they're going to want to choose the one that's not broken yet. So that way it doesn't just die outright.
Yep. Thankfully to me, when I did the last melee, I actually had 2 ambush cards, so I played them both on Scott.
Yes.
And broke both of the units. So he only had 1 firepower plus his die roll, so there was like no chance he was going to beat me.
Basically.
Unless I rolled real poorly and you got like a 12.
Yeah.
Could happen. So what are your thoughts on this?
I am really liking it so far. I've played so far as the attacker and the defender, and I think they both offer real interesting challenges. We've played a couple scenarios so far, and I'm really interested in trying out some of the recon scenarios where we both have 5 cards and we're both attack and defending.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the intro scenario, Fat Lip Key, that I played with Dylan, was recon. So that was my first exposure to the game, and it's definitely fun. So when you're attacking and defending, when you set up the game, the defender traditionally will set up his units on the majority of the board, and then the attacker will have just a small range of stuff in front of him, of hexes that he can place his units in. So when you play recon, you actually put a divider in the middle of the board, so each player is placing out their troops on their side of the board simultaneously, secretly. So then you reveal, and it's kind of fun just to see where the troops landed, and it definitely is a different flow of gameplay.
Yeah, and it can cause a lot of drastically different scenarios. It would seem like it might be that as soon as the scenario starts, you have units that can see each other.
Yeah, and so with the Mediterranean expansion, which if you buy the base box and you play a game of it and you're like, I really like this, just buy the Mediterranean one, especially because it goes in and out of print runs all the time from GMT. Get your hands on this, because that's how the game was meant to be played. It comes with a random scenario generator. And haven't tried it yet, but I've heard the random scenario generator is phenomenal, and that's how the game was designed. And then GMT told Chad Jensen that they needed to actually put in some historical scenarios out of the base box, and then could still have the random scenario generator. So I would really want to play with that. I've heard great things about it, and that means this map that we just played on with the scenario could be totally different with a random scenario.
Right. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the same countries involved.
And sometimes you don't even face the map this way. Right now we have it horizontally spread out between us. If you actually flipped it vertically, sometimes it actually will set that way. And typically in a recon scenario, it would probably be that.
Right. And that does matter because units cannot exit the sides of the map. Units that retreat have to go back to their own side. And if they fall off, then they are eliminated.
Plus, it's going to put a different focal point on different spots on the map, depending on which direction each player is playing from.
Right.
So basically a ton of replayability in this box.
Yes. Does the Mediterranean add more countries?
So the Mediterranean, also adds 3 new factions. So the base comes with Germans, the Americans, and the Russians.
Okay.
And then the expansion adds the Italians, and I don't remember. There's 2 other factions.
I believe the British are one of them.
British is one of them. I don't remember the 6th. Haven't played with them yet. We've just played with the base faction so far. But this is just something that I could play this game once a week right now. That's how I feel really good about this game.
Well, I like to hear that.
I really like this game.
Yeah.
And the more I play it, the more I like it.
Yeah. The most recent play that I've had of this is my favorite one so far, and I've enjoyed all 3 of them.
Yep. Just learning little bit as we go. And the last 2 plays prior to this one, we had some rule mishaps. And part of that is, even though the rules of this game are kind of easy to digest compared to other historical war games, there's a lot of rules.
Right. It's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah. And since I have the expansion, it also came with the rule book. So I kind of just hand a rule book to my partner, and I have these player aids off of BGG that help a lot. But occasionally, just learn this game as best you can, and then play it and kind of just check rules as you go. It will make sense. It really does start to click. And right now, this is one that I don't think it's, even if this sat on the shelf for 3 or 4 months, I think I could pull it off and still teach it without having to relearn it, which I think is a big testament to the amount of rules that are in this game. And as much that's going on, that I could still teach it, because I think it's so thematic and it flows so nicely together that it's very well designed, and it's not that hard to understand once you know what's going on.
Right. And I feel like a lot of that comes from the fact that the rules that you need to know to actually play aren't as large as, the entire rule set. Some things are completely incidental. You don't need to know how the Blaze rules work
until Blaze happens.
And you can't really plan for it either way. So it's not like you would flip it over and be like, oh, there's a blaze. Oh, if I had known how that worked, I would have done something differently.
Yeah. When you're teaching this game to somebody, don't go through teaching them, this is what happens if a blaze appears or if a smoke appears. Just let that play out organically and teach them as they go.
Right. It'll be a learning experience.
You may not see smoke in your first 3 plays, but then it may be a big thing in your 4th game. Who knows?
Right.
Yeah. I think that's probably the way to tackle this. The rulebook does specify that you're supposed to learn up through the orders and maybe I think up through the actions, but don't read the events and some of the extra stuff in the back of the rulebook. And then it says, then you're ready to play, and then reference the rulebook.
Right. And the cards are pretty good at telling you what they do.
And the rulebook has an index on the back that's incredibly useful. So like, okay, we need to figure out what's going on with Blaze. Just look at the back of the rulebook. It tells you where to pull it up. Really, there's not that much downtime checking the rules.
Right.
This is one of the easier, meatier historical war games I've learned in a good while. Like compared to Hannibal, 9 day.
Yeah. There's a huge difference there.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm really looking forward. I've just got Fighting Formations recently, also by Chad Jensen.
And I'm assuming that has vehicles in it?
That one has vehicles. It has tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and towed artillery pieces and everything.
Does the maps look similar?
Yes, they do look similar.
Okay. I'm excited to play it.
Yeah.
So yeah, Combat Commander is a huge thumbs up for me. I really think it has the chance to penetrate top 10. We'll see. There's a whole year ahead of me.
Yeah.
It can change, but I mean, it's floating around that area. I'm very big on it right now.
Yeah. I am also in love with this game.
Yeah. It's definitely hit the top 5 favorite historical war games I've played.
Yeah. I think this was a good introduction for the Hex Encounter war games for me, at least.
Yes. And you just played, Conflict of Heroes?
Yes. I also just recently last week played Conflict of Heroes,
which is a simpler Hex Encounter game that's similar. Correct?
Yeah. It's simpler. It adds some details in other areas.
And it's getting a 2nd or 3rd edition printing this summer.
Yes.
Yep.
I played the Storms of Steel, which is Kursk in 1943. That one adds some things where like units have ways that they're facing and you can flank them, and like wounds on units, instead of just them being broken, you'll have a random wound that does something special. Like they might be stunned or they may be cowering. And also it has vehicles, which this does not.
Right.
So like units will have regular firepower and also have like anti-armor firepower.
So what do you think vehicles versus infantry?
Well, I haven't played Conflict of Heroes with the vehicles yet, so I can't say there. I am interested in adding vehicles in Fighting Formations because I think it also adds an interesting layer where like units can be passengers and you can tow artillery, and it just adds a lot more. I do want to play this one a few more times still, but I'm also interested to add vehicles into the mix.
Right on. Yeah, I think infantry was a big selling point for me on this one over some of the other like entry level-ish Hex Encounter games. Just because even back when I played a bunch of video games like Call of Duty or Battlefield, the vehicles were always my least favorite part. I just wanted to be, a soldier, boots on ground, shooting at my enemy. And so I think that's a big appeal for me here. Sometimes I feel like tanks can be a little overpowered, but if the game balances it well,
right,
I'm interested in trying it out.
And like this one is very much on the individual level. Like the commanders have names. Last time that we played the Bonfire of the NKVD scenario, I ended up with a hero unit, which was just a dude who's good at fighting. And he's represented on the board. Yep.
And that's another event that can trigger, heroes can appear, and then one of your units can become veterans. And if your unit becomes a veteran, like you kind of get attached to that unit, and that
like
unit in
better
itself
at everything.
Has, because it's better at everything. It's a +1 on every stat. And it's just fun to kind of follow the narrative of just that individual piece to see what that veteran piece accomplishes. And that piece ended up winning like a big melee fight for me in our previous game. And I think had some good firing combat back and forth. Yeah. So it definitely lived up to its name, and it's just fun to see that.
Right. And that's another thing is that oftentimes you'll see events that you've never seen before.
Yep.
Because even though you'll see cards that have events on them, it doesn't trigger unless it's the card that you flip over when you roll an event die roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This game's good.
Yes, this has a lot of replayability between the random scenarios, the fact that it has 24 maps, and also just the replayability that the decks, the Fate decks add to it.
Yeah, and I know I've mentioned this on previous shows before, but I just loved the micro zoomed in infantry level squad based combat that this game exudes over the big macro level move one unit from like country to country kind of thing, which those games are fun for sure. And it's a total different type of like tactics and thought that goes into playing something like that. But there's just something very intimate and stressful about having these units with names on the board and the way they move around.
Right. Like when you advance and fire, with a chit here, you're moving 4 guys and having them shoot their rifles at someone.
In this, I don't care. Macro level games are great. And I love a lot of macro level games, but I will never love a macro level map like I do a map like this, where it's zoomed in on a specific location and you get very familiar with the terrain and obstacles and everything that's on the map. That's a big selling point for me.
Yeah, and that is one advantage that the small scale, like single battle maps have, is that they can be detailed with the terrain, which is not something that you can really portray with as much detail on, the strategic level.
Yep. Yes, absolutely. Anything else you're wanting to add?
I think that's about it. I think we've covered this pretty well. I think the audience has a pretty good idea that we like this game.
Pretty good.
I would say this game is pretty good.
So, okay, I have to ask one final question before you wrap up your show.
All right, what do you got?
So, how does this weigh with other war games in your collection that you've been enjoying, like Napoleonics, Memoir? I know they're different, but...
Yeah. I mean, if I have the time for it, this replaces Memoir.
Okay.
Memoir's main advantage is that it's quick to play and that I can play it with someone who, maybe isn't ready for a game like this.
Sure.
But if I have someone willing, this comes out over Memoir every time.
It has the same goofy like randomness of Memoir, but
right.
I feel like it's more serious. And when it happens, I don't know. Memoir is literally just die roll craziness.
Right. There's more of a narrative to the randomness. When something silly or something, like really good for you happens,
you can always tie it back to a thematic reason.
There's a reason that it happened. Like, oh, this unit broke because of sniper fire. It's not just like, I rolled 3 grenades and so I just wiped them out.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so out of all the war games you played recently, which one are you itching to get back to table the quickest?
Out of all the ones that I've played recently, this is the one that I'm most excited to play again.
Me too. This is very cool. All right, that's what I got. I had to interrogate you a little bit.
All right.
So it's a pretty good game.
This game is pretty good. All right. Thank you all for joining us for this episode about Combat Commander Europe. I'm Scott. See you later.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.
Thanks for joining me.
See you later.